For those of you I have not met, I am Dr. B. The B is for everyone else's E's because I have a very long Italian name and it just kind of stuck when people saw all the double consonants and went, no. But I'm the clinical director of TIGS.CA. And so while the rest of the team is getting mic'd up, I want to talk to you a little bit about, oh yeah, hi Kelly. You probably need a microphone for this one. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the white paper. So who has either read or heard about our recent white paper on the state of the game? Oh, goody! Oh, that's fun. Okay, so get to introduce a lot of you to this. So about a year ago, our executive director, Crevoshay, decided that we need to coalesce all of the data that exists on what's been going on in the mental health and in the game industry for years. People have been talking about it for years. I mean, how long have you been hearing about crunch? How long have you been hearing about burnout? How long have you been hearing about a lot of things? But to date, no one has ever done an academic review of what all of the research that exists. And so we decided, well, Eve decided that we're gonna do this. And we're gonna write this in about 3 months. And that did not happen because it turned out to be such a monumental thing that it ended up taking us closer to 9 with a team of roughly 15 contributing authors. So if you're curious to read the 60-page behemoth that is extremely valuable and wonderful, it is available for free on our website at takethis.org. We're going to be going over some of the sections of it as well as their importance overall to why it's applicable. But it's broken apart into basically 3 different categories. Job instability, workplace stress, and crunch. Diversity and inclusion, as well as the public perception of games. Like, we all know that games cause violence, right? Right. All the mental health types who have read the research are like, oh, I'm gonna grumble, grumble, grumble. And we all know that games are horribly addictive, right? And we're all in on the conspiracy, right, to make them as addictive as possible. Okay, well, just as long as we're on the same page and we know we can keep that in we know it's ridiculous. But the paper also addresses the public perception of games and how, as a secondary stressor, it impacts everyone in the game industry. And so if everybody's mic'd up, everybody's ready to roll, let's bring the rest of the Take This team on. Our executive director, Crevoshay, our research director, Dr. Rachel Kowert, and you've all met Dr. Kelli Dunlap, who is one of the contributors on this paper. So,
visual representation.
It is an actual paper, a visual representation. So, I guess this has been talked about for now as long as people can really remember. Why are we actually making a paper? What's the importance of actually making a paper about it when everybody knows this stuff's an issue?
It's not about knowing it's an issue. It's about understanding the basis of it, the foundation of it, what we know about it, what we can do about it. If you want to have solutions, you have to understand the problem first. You might be able to tell I'm an academic. Give me the data. What do we know? We can't solve it unless we know. It's one thing just to say, crunch is an issue. It's another to say, this is what crunch is. This is the effect it has on our well-being. And these are ways we can mitigate the problems that it's creating.
Yep. Yeah.
So in other words, it's distilling the emotion and the reactions, and instead of just looking at one person's lived experience, really trying to coalesce the data that exists across the entirety of the industry and make it more representative.
And create a business case for it.
Create a business case for it.
So we know kind of anecdotally and emotionally that crunch is bad and diversity is important and we should treat people like people. But we don't have a lot of tools to say why that's good for our businesses and how that should and can play out across the game industry. And so without data and without backup, we don't have a lot of ways to have that conversation at an industry level, at a macro level. And so this was an attempt to provide a first set of tools to start that conversation and to make it more concrete for people in the industry. And then there's the follow-up work we're doing We've started a working group of HR professionals in the industry and a number of other things like this conference, et cetera, that help us move that conversation forward at a more macro level so that we can come to new sets of standards, new cultural norms across the industry, et cetera.
So in other words, it becomes a foundational layer for future efforts instead of,
Yeah.
Jacobson in accounting told me that they were burned out. We actually have this well-cited reference point to base things off of. So what are some of the business impacts? I mean, you've broached that topic. Beyond the human capital, what do we know?
So we know, essentially what the white paper has told us and what we kind of understand already is that burnout and the related issues of instability across the industry, boom and bust cycles, in a hit-driven entertainment business, create a really unstable workforce, and so we don't have a lot of longevity in the industry. Ken, you're an outlier. and that's the truth. Most people in the game industry are young, and a lot of people age themselves out because they want to try and have families and stability, and they can't do that. And so that's a concern, a major concern, because with experience and longevity in the industry comes a lot of wisdom, right? We need that. We need that to make good games, to have stable game companies, et cetera. We also know that there's a business case around diversity and inclusion in terms of the quality of the work that gets done and the level of creativity and stability in companies. And there's research that exists on that outside of the game industry. We'd like to have the opportunity to do that specifically inside the industry, but there is plenty of anecdotal evidence that the more diverse a group of people are who make a game, the better the game is, and the better the game company is. And so that's something that's really important to us. And then then there's a separate issue of harassment in games. Nobody's going to be surprised for me to, that I say this.
Well, I don't think a lot of what we found is going to be a shock to a
No,
lot of the
none of
people
it is
in
a
this
surprise.
room. I mean,
It's
you all know all of this stuff, and you've all experienced it too.
Yeah. So, with the opportunity that we had was to put it all together, to put a case behind it, a research case behind it, and kind of make it an irrefutable block of evidence that then we have to then deal with. We can't ignore. And the issue around harassment, there's an issue related to diversity and inclusion and harassment, and then there's an issue related to, and it's not unrelated, it's part of the same culture, and I'll say first that harassment of game makers by game players and fans is something that we're deeply concerned with, and the feedback we've gotten is that that's a big issue. And that we can't fix the internet, right? As a game industry, we're not the ones who are going to be able to fix all of the internet and all of social media, but we can create a new set of norms and expectations inside games around what is acceptable, and we can also educate our fans and our players about what is involved in making games in a way, hopefully, this is kind of a wish of ours across every finger and toe, that helps to bridge that gap and helps to explain, it's really hard to make good games. How do we do that? How do we kind of open the door a little bit, show behind the curtain a little bit in a way that changes the interaction, the mode of interaction between fans and individuals. And there's technology solutions, there's cultural norms solutions, there's a variety of ways in which we want to talk about that and address it.
Oh, we're definitely going to have time to talk about that. And one of the things, if you have questions about this, this is a small enough group that I think, do we want to just field any questions people might have? I think this is a manageable group to have that. So please, if you have questions about that, please feel free to raise your hand, chime in. I'll repeat it so everybody else can hear it, and we'll go on with that. Dr. Kelli, you mentioned burnout.
Yeah.
And it being more than just about exhaustion.
Yeah, so typically when you think about burnout, what you see covered, the kind of schema that comes to mind is like, oh, you're just working too hard. You're just tired because you're working too hard, and that's really not the case. Burnout is psychological, it's mental, it's emotional, and it's physical. It has effects on every aspect of your well-being. For example, if you are burned out, that is typically the result of chronic stress. At a biological level, when our bodies are chronically stressed, we are in fight or flight mode, which releases cortisol into the body, and in short bursts, it's fine. Like, it's what allowed us to escape from tigers. You get that adrenaline burst and you go. But when it's prolonged over time, it actually literally starts to eat away at your own body, which is why stress kills, literally. Like, it will eat away at the walls of your arteries if there's too much cortisol in your system and you're in that kind of fight or flight stage for too long. At a psychological level, you can become detached, socially isolated. You're too tired to do anything. You don't have that self-care. Socially, you may separate from your families. You may shut down. You may, again, isolate. And then emotionally, there's depression, anxiety, pretty much everything under the sun that you can think of, because you're tapped out. Every resource you have, biological, psychological, emotional, mental, everything has just been exhausted to the point where you can't function anymore.
Well, I know in the paper we talk about it being a three-part model. That one part of it is, of course, exhaustion, but the other part of it, other two parts of it, are a cynicism, that detachment that you towards other people and even your own well-being. But another one is a sense of ineffectiveness, which ties into a lot of the project-based nature of the game industry. So. What can people do?
That's a good
And by the way,
question.
the pressure is entirely on you to come up with one unified answer that everybody can implement in the next week.
Everybody should go to therapy.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Therapy for all.
Yes. I mean, so part of it is recognizing before you get there. Like, you shouldn't have to hopefully hit rock bottom, the 10 on your stress meter, before you're like, whoa, I need to take care of myself, and there's some things that I need to do, whether that's step back, whether that's take a break, whether that's lean on resources, whether it is a therapist, whether it's friends, whether it's you carve out 10 minutes a day to play Candy Crush, whatever it is that you need to just keep going. I know before becoming Dr. Professor Kelli, I had a job as like an office manager, and it was horrible. Like, I was definitely depressed, didn't think about it then, definitely was. And one of the things that I had found to be helpful was like, okay, Monday, what is one good thing that is going to happen on Monday? I'm going to Chipotle. Okay. Tuesday, what is one good thing? Okay, there's a soccer game on Tuesday. And that's literally how I got from day to day, from week to week. I was miserable in that job, and that was one aspect of it, was focusing on the things that I could control, and then branching out, getting support, getting help. And so I was very fortunate that I didn't actually burn out, and I continued on. So that's one way. Mm-hmm. Leverage the resources that you have and try to nip it in the bud if at all possible.
So how do you recognize you're getting to that point? I think this is for anybody here. Like, what are the warning signs
For burnout?
Of burnout?
Apathy.
That's what I
Apathy.
was going to say. Apathy.
Yeah.
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 Exhaustion.
Yeah, chronic exhaustion and distraction.
Yeah.
But what I want to say is, Kelli, obviously you're right. You know what you're talking about.
A little bit.
But I want to bring it up one level, which is why is there so much burnout in the game industry, right?
Well.
Like, what are the things that make that possible and make it so common? And those, like, we talk about those in the white paper, right?
Yes.
The production cycle.
The production cycle, the frequency of layoffs and like just company instability, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we I have no qualms in admitting that I don't have these solutions yet. We have to have these conversations. I have some thoughts about where we might go, but what are the ways to mitigate some of that instability across the industry, mm-hmm. so that people feel like they know what to expect? Mm-hmm. Because it is very stressful to not know what to expect, or to know that your job is going to be gone the minute the game is released. That is not those are over the long term, those are not actually tenable ways to function, right? They exist all the time, they're really common, but they're not ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just even from like a numbers game, just super, super basic, to replace an employee, whether they drop because of burnout, because of harassment, because of lack of support, because of the instability, it is approximately 50 to 60% of their salary. And if you have to actually train
Their
the
annual
person,
salary.
their annual salary, yes. And then if you actually have to train the new person coming in, that gets upwards of 200% of that person's annual salary. So if we're talking about business case, like literally the numbers are there of that you want to retain people because it's good for your bottom line. You're going to spend less money. There's going to be less friction among teammates because if, you know, anytime you onboard somebody, the culture changes. Even in a large studio, bringing on one person changes how we interact with one another as an organization, as an organism. And so if you can keep it as stable as possible in every sense of the word, you're going to get a better outcome. You're going to get a better product. You're going to have more stability. Your workers are going to be, they don't have to be happy, but they can at least be productive and engaged in what they're doing. Hopefully they're happy, but you know, giving them the opportunity to do their best work is going to produce the best outcome.
Well, and also, I mean, we in a previous white paper we did, our Crunch Hurts white paper, we talked about a correlation to increased Metacritic scores as well with a decreased use of crunch. So, I mean, there's both a fiscal and a human cost element to both of these. So, going to the human cost, I'm going to kick this over to Dr. Kowert, because you know your research has focused extensively on the social ramifications of games.
Right.
And so I wonder what you have to say on the effects of public perception on game industry employees.
So much to say. We have unprecedented access to the people who create the games we love. And for every one of me being like, I love your game, there's a handful of people who do not love your game. And the fact that they have, through social media, pretty much direct access to the people who make their games has caused a lot of short-term stress and long-term, on the other end of the spectrum, post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't say that lightly. That is legitimately what's happening with the level of harassment and just feedback that people are getting from social media. And the issue here isn't necessarily that we have access. The issue is that there aren't any guidelines about how to moderate the access. So we talk about this a lot in the white paper, and for me, this is one of the things that has the easiest solution because it's just about setting frameworks and guidelines for the people who work in the gaming industry. What do I do if somebody will not leave me alone on Reddit telling me that they hate the character that I created? Do I ignore them? Do I respond to them? Do I send them to somebody else? Things have escalated to the point where people lose their jobs over this, and it's not fair to the employee to have to try and mitigate this personal and professional persona on social media without any support or any guidelines about how to do that. So we talk a lot about how to make that better for the game developers and how they can kind of draw those lines and boundaries so it's not getting to the point of post-traumatic stress disorder or to the point of losing their job over, you know, a troll on Twitter who will not leave them alone, basically.
Well, what you've talked about, like what's a simple quote unquote simple solution?
Yeah,
I mean,
I know.
What's the solution that you've recommended?
I don't know. What is the solution? What did I recommend?
Well, I mean, we talk about the need for like really strong social media policies that insert like a second layer of moderation and support between game makers and game players.
Yes. Oh, and I also talk about the second aspect of the public perception of games is when people are interacting with people in the game industry and they're not in the game industry or they don't like research and study games, they're coming with, 30, 40 years of games are bad, games make you violent, games make you addicted, games make you aggressive, and that is always in the back of the mind. So I talk a lot about education in terms of media effects and just a base level of knowledge. So people have that background of scientific information like, look, we've been studying games for 30 years. There's no evidence that they change our real world behaviors, honestly, in any kind of significant way for any long-term period of time. And even just having that level of information, I think, makes you more empowered when, an angry an angry mom says, your game made my kid addicted and now their lives are ruined. It's like, it wasn't my game. There was no scientific evidence to suggest that my game is what is ruining your life. Please stop berating me.
Well, I mean, you know about my interest in moral panic and all that. I could go long-winded on that, but how do we combat that as an industry? The idea that a lot of violence in media studies are flawed, just methodologically.
Good new research.
Information.
What was that?
Information. The research is there, especially with violence and addiction and even loot boxes and gambling, which is the hot topic now, especially in Canada. The information is there, and I published a book several years ago called The Video Game Debate, and when I pitched it to the publisher, my exact line was like, we've had this information in the scientific community for 20 years, and it somehow has never escaped the ivory tower. It's not written in a journal article that normal people can access, or it's not written in language that like everyone can understand, and it's ridiculous. So we know that there is no scientific link between video games and aggression, but no one else would know that if you looked at the headlines or if you looked at the stories that get picked up. Yeah.
Can you tell we're all a little passionate about this? I mean, this is a soapbox we'll all stand on all day.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ken.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
to sort of interrupt there, but
Yeah.
I think it's really important as an industry that, I think you're absolutely right that we can't tar games with one brush, that there's
Yeah.
such a wide spectrum, but at the same point, I feel like we also can't hide our warts.
Sure.
And I feel like to blanket say that they don't contribute to these issues is a little bit as misleading as to say that they do cause violence, in the sense that I know as a teenager I would come out watching a Jean-Claude Van Damme film and you'd want to fight, and you would come out from watching The Mission and you'd be full of empathy. So there's no doubt that entertainment does affect our emotions and does affect the way that we perceive the world around us and the way that we interact with others. And we also know that in the industry there are some companies who hire neuroscientists to create behavioral conditioning in their games, to create compulsive mechanisms in the gameplay itself. The casinos have done it for years, and we would be remiss to say that they don't actively contribute to the promotion of addiction, because that's what they're there for. So I think that you're absolutely right that there's a lot of positivity in the game stuff, but I feel like we have to acknowledge that there are some negative influences in the industry.
So
It takes the responsibility away from us as developers to make sure we don't do that.
just to summarize that for everyone in case you didn't hear, so that to paint the game industry as universally good with a broad stroke can be just as detrimental as painting it universally negative. That we need to be honest and transparent as an industry about hiring things like behavioral scientists to increase engagement.
I mean, I agree that I don't want to paint it with a broad stroke that it's all candy and roses. But I am very much just like a numbers, science kind of gal. And when you look at the science about literally any behavioral change over the long term from any media, movies, games are not found to be particularly special, even though they're interactive, which is always the line people like to use. Movies, television, rock and roll. It's short term. So yes, you watch the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie and then you want to go with your brother in the backyard and fight, but that is completely different from saying you're going to go commit a mass shooting because you played GTA. And that's more what I'm getting at, because while that is a more nuanced version, which is what you're discussing, and I absolutely agree, that is not what we get in the public sphere. So my mom told me the other day that playing violent video games translates into committing violent crime in real life, and scientifically that is just not true, and it's been studied for 30 years in 100 different ways. And with the behavioral scientists, they do work with games industry to make games more engaging. But from a scientific and clinical point of view, lining that up with addiction is a completely different step. And it's easy to take that step when we see it in the news or in the media, but from a scientific and clinical perspective, that is actually a very large step to say that it is a diagnosable, distinct addiction that is impacting, our physical, social, psychological, every aspect of our lives over a prolonged period of time. I absolutely don't want to give the impression, again, that I'm saying like everything's perfect, but in terms of it also being like video games are destroying our lives, just like Elvis destroyed my parents' generation, you know, it's kind of in that same vein.
And Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
for sure.
So
For sure.
I want to kind of parse out a little bit what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is, you know, there's a conversation right now specifically around game addiction because of the inclusion in the ICD-10, which is a international diagnostic manual of internet gaming disorder. Right. This just happened, and in reality, our understanding of addiction related to video games is very, very poor. We don't really understand, and there's a concern. There's a great deal of concern in the psychological and psychiatric community around the distinction between game addiction as a thing in and of itself and game addiction as a secondary problem related to a primary diagnosis. And there's been no good research. It doesn't exist.
It's probably the second one.
It's probably, and we are of the general thinking that probably it's the latter, right? However, there are also game mechanics that are designed to keep people engaged. In fact, the free-to-play, so my husband runs a small game studio, he does a lot of free-to-play games. He has to keep people engaged in order to make any money on his game, right? So the whole ecosystem that's developed around free-to-play games has created a necessity for ongoing, constant engagement in games. That's a separate conversation that it has been necessitated by the financial model in the game industry to some degree. And we can't equate those things psychologically, game addiction and games that require people to stay checked in and to keep and high engagement of that stuff. And so we just want to be really, really careful about how we describe different game mechanics. And then gambling and loot boxes are a separate conversation once again. And so as long as we're clear that these all do exist, but that they are rather distinct from each other, then I think we can have a much more productive conversation with clear distinctions about the different pieces.
So in other words, the remedy in this is more nuance. You know, to not paint everything in black and white universal terms, but to get into the nitty-gritty that engagement may not, repetitive behavior may not equal addiction. It may equal something else, somebody compensating for post-traumatic stress disorder, somebody engaging in their special interest because they're on the autism spectrum. There could be any number of reasons, we don't know this. But bringing this back around, how does this affect game industry workers?
Stress.
So more
Traumatic
stress.
stress disorder, anxiety. And it's also about just, like I mentioned before, like blurred lines. Like it's not clear, like where does my job end and my personal identity begin when you're interacting on social media with people who are fans of your games or people who are not so much fans of your games.
Yeah.
So what has the response been to the paper so far?
Pretty positive.
Pretty positive.
Actually, very positive.
Very positive.
Very
Like, what's come out of it? Like, I know you mentioned, Eve, that an HR working group
Yeah.
that's come out of this. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've gathered a group of people who lead HR functions at companies from about 100 people up through about 500 to slightly larger, actually, yeah, 1,000. And we're going to tackle over the course of the year, we're going to tackle each of the sections of the white paper and identify either some pilot projects in these companies that we can do to try to address this, develop some best practices or strategies or recommendations, and identify the areas where we don't know enough and try to do some additional research. And that is our first attempt, really, at trying to understand how to change, to do culture change in the industry around some of these norms. One of the challenges there is that I have learned is that probably we also really need to be speaking to producers and game directors. And I will make a point about this too, because I just said the size, we talked about the size of these companies. There's a really different set of challenges among indie devs and companies that are much smaller. And a lot of those, especially at the very smallest, among the very smallest devs, individuals, companies that are 5 people or less, it's literacy, like business literacy, business training. People come to games and game development with a passion, and passion doesn't equal stability or funding or budgets or things like that. And so we're also exploring separately, how do we create some of those basic supports and provide stability to indie companies. And it's like, we have to deal with the antecedents. We have to deal, like mental health, why do we have mental health challenges? Because of instability, because we have this idea that if we're passionate, then we can do anything. And so we have to kind of dismantle those myths and those conceptualizations of the industry before we can make progress on the mental health itself.
And I think you have a really good point about what works for a big studio doesn't work for a small studio.
Yeah.
As much as we talk about like crunch and burnout and cultural change, which is more a problem than not, there are also some companies who are doing things well, like Ubisoft. I think we mentioned in the paper about their pool of employees to try and prevent the mass hire and mass fire. So there are definitely changes happening in the industry. It's about finding out where those changes happening, who's doing it well, how do we spread that information, and how does it apply to studios, big and small.
Yeah, and to the ongoing conversation about how things are so different in the UK, we've spoken to 2 studios. One is a Ubisoft studio, one is an Xbox studio, who are doing really amazing employee wellness, mental health programming in their studios, and have taken a really comprehensive approach to it. And it's because the conversation in the UK has just advanced so much farther than it has in the US or in Canada. So also the conversation is, how do we advance the broader cultural conversation about mental health and normalize the experience of mental health challenges, because 1 in 2 people over the course of their lifetime will experience a mental health challenge. That is fully half of the population. It is a normal thing to experience mental health challenges. I go see a therapist. If I just say that as a matter of fact, right, I appear to be a relatively normal human being, right? So
Well, you do work in the game industry.
I do. I didn't for a while. Worked in the nonprofit industry, which is another questionable choice, I suppose. But you know, we have to just say these things and make them part of everyday conversation. Yeah.
And one thing that didn't come up in the white paper, and maybe it'll be through the white paper version too,
Yep.
is the idea of educating the next generation of game designers. I know my students, they are assigned the white paper to read, at least the job burnout section, like the job section, and then when we do our module on like diversity and inclusion, they'll read that section as well. Because systemic change is hard.
Yeah.
Like you need buy-in from people who don't really want to buy in, and so while I'm not writing that off, obviously, and just waiting for the dinosaurs to die, I think it's really important as an educator that when I'm talking to my students, I'm super real with them about the challenges of the game industry. You know, their chances of breaking in, the crunch, and it's really hard to get past their optimism, and I don't want to crush that. You know, I really don't want to crush their souls. But I'm just trying to be like hyper realistic with them. And I guess most importantly is that when I'm in the classroom, I try to model what a good working relationship looks like. You know, if I'm late on something, I apologize, I hold myself accountable. If a student needs to take the day to go do something, like, I don't berate them and say, oh, you're gonna take a hit to your participation. I mean, it's going to be different for different students. I have master's students, they're at a different level. But like letting them know, one, having the information up front, so when they go into the industry, they have at least that background. And then also, I want them to be able to experience, okay, this doesn't feel good. Like, why doesn't this feel good? Because they had that experience with me in my studio of what it feels like to work with a good boss, what it feels like to have a good project management system, what it feels like to not crunch your final paper, which I know they're going to do anyway. But I think that's an interesting component, because if the upcoming workforce has that with them and are like, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. I think you see that with, you know, Gamers Unite and trying to unionize and things like that. That change is coming, and so hopefully it's also in the best business interests of these companies to like get ahead of that. Otherwise, the workforce isn't going to want to work for you with the caveat that everybody wants to work in the games industry, which is why people are so expendable and why companies don't tend to take care of their people. So I think that's going to be the tension that we have to walk. But yeah, kids are the future. Let's teach them stuff.
Well, we're going full Whitney Houston on this.
Yes.
I believe the children are our future.
Kids are all right.
Teach them well,
Teach them
Kelly. So,
Yes.
but you're bringing up an interesting idea that while this was a much more massive undertaking than any of us initially anticipated, coalescing the research that was there, where do you mention White Paper 2.0, State of the Mental Health Industry 2.0. Where do you see the current state of research lacking that needs to advance further to help our understanding?
I mean, the biggest thing that I learned from this white paper experiment was there's no information. Like, if you look at the white paper, there's tons of fantastic research. We have business, we have HR, we have psychology, we have sociology, we have physiology, we have production. Like, we have this a paper as diverse as the games industry itself in terms of like disciplines that had to be pulled in and to be represented, which is why we had so many authors, because there were so many fields that we covered. I don't know where I was going with that, but it was going to be good.
Well, it almost sounds like you were leading up to saying basically there's no direct research on the game industry itself.
So we pulled from we pulled from existing resources of like, this works in business world and this works in a psychology lab, and this is what we've learned from, you know, industrial organizational psychology. Like, there's these tomes of research about it, but it's never been applied specifically in the games industry. And so I think that is an important next step, is like, do the principles of IO Psych, which talk about different management structures and different ways to retain employees, and the importance of like hygiene factors, which is a specific IO thing. It does not have to do with body odor. It's very different. But like
job hygiene factors.
Job hygiene factors,
Yes.
like hygiene factors versus motivator factors,
Right.
in classic IO. Does that work in the game space? We don't know, because it doesn't seem like anybody's ever done it, or if they have, they haven't promoted it in a way that we were able to find during our
It's
lit
not on
review.
Google Scholar.
It's not on Google Scholar.
There isn't a lot of research also on the effects of better management and better diversity and better inclusion on the quality of games and or the diversity in types of games, right? I think we have a lot of cultural assumptions in the industry around what makes a good game, who is going to play a said game, and how you make a game. And there are a lot of people who are really thoughtful, who in one breath will say, crunch is awful, oh, but we can't avoid it. And I'm sorry, but we can't keep going in that direction. Like, that's not okay. We do make a distinction, and we're very clear to make a distinction between long-term cultural crunch and short-term, oh shit, we have a game to release in a week and we just found a major bug. That does happen. That, I'm sure you've been through that recently, Scott, and your team, right, with Whittle. So, but it's, we really need to make those specific connections, and that's some of what we're hoping to do. Over
I
the
would
next
love
few
to do
years.
that research
Yes.
for you.
Yes.
She
Love to
is
do that
just
research.
champing at the bit to do some
love
of
to
this
do it,
research.
yeah.
So if you
Yeah.
want that kind of research, there you go. There's your team.
We do
right
need
there.
funding for it.
Oh yeah, we do need funding. I know that's
But I will do it.
the eternal plight of a nonprofit.
But you mentioning crunch made me think of like my favorite quote in the entire white paper is that it's not that crunch is inherently bad, and I think maybe it was your husband who said this, was who is benefiting from your overwork? And if it's you, I mean, it's not healthy, but there are some people who love game jams, and that is ostensibly short-term crunch.
Yeah.
Because it's a way, for my job, for iThrive, we ran a game jam for, I think most of them were college kids, and we had like, okay, we stop at 9 p.m., and we start again at 9 a.m., so you all go home and sleep. They hated it. And what they told us was that, you know, when we do these game jams, this is my time with my friends. This is my time to create and to connect and to like be part of something, you know, make something really cool. And so in that sense, our like, we're anti-crunch really backfired because they were not happy about it. And so yeah, I think it does come back to that question of who is benefiting from your overwork. Is it you and your friends having fun making something you care about? Is it, you know, the company that necessarily is, important to feeding everybody and it's a short-term thing where, okay, we can get through this? Or is it some faceless corporate entity that's going to get a second, house in the Bahamas? And then figuring out where you stand ethically on that practice based on who's benefiting.
Well, and that actually factors heavily into the model of burnout that we highlight, in that a sense of efficacy in one's job is a protective factor against burnout. Because if you, and we heard this when we talked to people about it, that project cancellations that you can't throw on your resume because of NDAs, that suddenly you've been working on a project for multiple years and suddenly it doesn't exist and you can't prove to the next person, especially if you're a newbie in the industry, you can't prove that you're hireable because you can't talk about this project. That increases the sense of, what am I doing? Why am I doing it?
What's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? So why am I benefiting from all these hours I put in that poof went up like that? So then we've covered a lot of ground. And again, I'd encourage everybody to please, it's a meaty paper, but it's well worth the read. I'm not saying that just because I was one of the authors, but it really is well worth the read. It's available on our website for free at takethis.org. But we've covered a lot of ground. What's one thing you would want everybody here to leave understanding?
There's a quote in the white paper, and I can't remember the exact number. I think it's 24% of people or 22% of people said they did not believe that they did not need more diverse games, which means 75% of people believe that games should be more
that was
diverse.
the EA survey. It
Yeah.
was 13% of people, only 13%, about 1 out of 7 people thought we had enough diversity in
Right.
games.
Yep.
Long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I would say that the takeaway is that the assumptions we have about how to make games are only assumptions. That it's possible to think differently about making games.
So it's possible to do things differently, maybe even better.
Possibly.
Like maybe incorporating mental health themes is not a way to say don't buy my game, right?
Right.
Well, I just gave my favorite quote, so
Yeah,
I'm
we
trying to think of a separate one.
You can reiterate it. Assumptions. You can say the same thing again.
So I guess what I hope people take away from the paper is that there are people who care about this issue. One of the most heartbreaking things I ever heard, I was at GDC, I was hosting the mental health SIG roundtable that we have, so it's the International Game Developers Association Special Interest Group. Everybody gets around this giant table and we talk about, it was mental health. And somebody asked me, why don't mental health professionals care about us? Like, why aren't there enough of you, and why don't you care? And I was like, oh my God, you don't.
I remember that question.
Oh, and it was a gut punch, because on one hand I want to explain, like, I have $200,000 in student debt, okay? I'm not even licensed, I wasn't at the time, I'm not even licensed, I can't even see people. Like, the hurdles in mental health to getting to a point where you can actually help somebody are obscene. And then if you want to have something as specialized as tech, which has been a huge ask from the industry people that I've spoken with, is I don't want to spend an hour telling my therapist what a sprint cycle is. I just want them to understand. I don't want to have to explain to them, all these nuances that I have to go through. Why am I paying to tell somebody about my job? I want help. I want support. This goes back to the harassment thing too. There's a huge problem with internet-based complex PTSD that traditional PTSD treatments aren't working. Basically, the kind of complex trauma that someone like Zoe Quinn or someone else who has survived like years of harassment, what we know how to do as psychologists isn't working. It's not good enough. And so there's this question around, well, one, why don't mental health professionals care? Why aren't there more of them? And why aren't there more instances where they're in the same room? So, I mean, my answer is always, have you heard of Take This? But that to me is I think the takeaway is that it's important, and it's important to the people who are working in it because they gave you your time, they gave you those quotes. At the roundtable, they're talking about how mental health is something crucially important to them. And so there's hope because people want this. The vast majority of people want this. It's, not to say, fight the man, but pretty much, we have to change the status quo, which is never easy. But we can do it because we have the skills, we have the willpower, we have the strength.
We have the technology.
We have the technology, et cetera,
We
et
are
cetera.
doing it.
We're
We are
doing
doing
it.
it.
We're doing it right now.
So hope.
Yay, hope. So are there any last minute questions that, we're going to be around, obviously, for the next 2 days.
Oh,
but-
no, I'm leaving.
Are you bouncing?
Yeah, I'm bouncing.
Okay. Any last minute questions that y'all have? Yes? So is there any other industry, based on the research, that is close to the game industry?
I mean, in a lot of ways, the easiest comparison is the entertainment, like film and television. Yeah. Not that we found. Yeah.
I would say startup tech as well. Also, no,
Yeah.
not really research, no.
An interesting idea, I don't think that we've tapped into it, is like famous athletes. Because I know they, like every sports team has a sports psychologist, and their entire purpose is to help the players stay focused, even when they've got 10 million people sending them, oh, you missed that last touchdown, you suck. Like, how do you keep your head in this space to stay focused and do your job? I think that's an interesting place for exploration that hasn't, like, I literally thought of it right here. So.
Well, I know that some of the esports teams are
Esports,
starting
yeah,
to bring
that's-
that in because there's, I mean, obvious parallels there.
Yeah.
But I would like to see that as well. That more teams start doing that. Yes, Doris.
I have a question around Game Developers Conference and how receptive they are to technical proposals and talking about this.
So,
Okay. So how
Interesting.
receptive is GDC, the Game Developers Conference, to panels on mental health? Eve, I think you might have some interesting insight on that.
I joined the advisory board this year of the GDC, and I'm on the advocacy track. And we had our retreat a few weeks ago, and we were all able to ensure that there was significant mental health representation in the main conference. That's what the advisory board does. And then there's summits on Monday and Tuesday, and there's also those are not part of the advisory board's purview, but there was also some conversation about that. There's also, now that I'm part of that group, there's a conversation I'm having with UBM, the organizers of GDC, around how to bring mental health awareness to the conference itself. That's an ongoing conversation, but it is a topic. I'm really hopeful, given that I have a place at that table, and I was the only person in the room there who's not involved in the making of games on a daily basis, but I have a seat there, and my voice was significant. So I'm very hopeful that there's an opportunity there. Yeah. Yeah.
Good question. Any other questions before we break for lunch?
What's for lunch?
I believe it's on that table, whatever it is. I haven't gone over there and looked.
That was my question.
Sandwiches. Wow. Okay. Awesome. Any last minute questions? I hear murmurs. Okay. Well, I would talk about the sandwiches too.
Great.
All right. Well, then, thank you, everybody. Enjoy your lunch. We'll come back in about an hour.